There's a quote that should send chills down the spine of anyone who hears it. A Nazi official and economist named Walter Funk once said that if Switzerland stopped exchanging hard currency for its gold, Germany could not hold out for more than 2 months. Let that sit for a moment. The entire Nazi war machine, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the conquest of Europe, all of it depended on the willingness of bankers to keep the money flowing. And they did. They kept it flowing right up until the final hours of the war. They profited from it enormously. And when the guns fell silent and the world finally saw the horror of the death camps, these bankers walked away, not to prison cells, not to courtrooms. They walked into corner offices and retirement villas and positions of even greater power. This is the story of the financial institutions that bankrolled the Holocaust, laundered the stolen wealth of murdered families, and then spent the next 50 years pretending none of it ever happened. Now, to understand how this was even possible, you have to understand something about how modern warfare actually works. Wars are not just fought with soldiers and ammunition, they are fought with money. Without cash, without foreign currency, without the ability to buy raw materials on the international market, no modern army can function. Hitler understood this, his inner circle understood this, and the bankers of Europe and America understood this most of all. The question was never whether finance played a role in the Holocaust. The question was always how deep that role went. And the answer, as decades of investigations and declassified documents would eventually reveal, is that it went deeper than almost anyone ever imagined. Let's start with the country that became the beating financial heart of the Nazi war effort, Switzerland. Now, Switzerland had built its entire national identity around the concept of neutrality. It had stayed out of the First World War. It stayed out of the Second. And its banking system, famous for its secrecy, had attracted deposits from people all over Europe, including hundreds of thousands of Jewish families who saw Switzerland as a safe place to store their wealth. These were families in Germany, Austria, Poland, Hungary, people who could see the darkness gathering and wanted to protect something for their children and grandchildren. They put their life savings into Swiss accounts, trusting that the legendary discretion of Swiss banking would keep their money safe no matter what happened. And for a while, it seemed like a wise decision. Swiss banking secrecy was not some informal tradition or gentleman's agreement. It was codified into law in 1934, making it a criminal offense for any bank employee to reveal information about a client's account. The penalty was imprisonment. This was the strongest financial privacy law in the world, and it acted as a gravitational pull on wealth from every corner of Europe. Jewish merchants in Berlin, factory owners in Vienna, doctors in Budapest, they all moved portions of their savings into Swiss accounts as the political situation deteriorated throughout the 1930s. Many of them opened accounts under pseudonyms or through intermediaries, adding another layer of protection. They were trusting the system with their family's future. They believed Swiss neutrality and the integrity of the banking system would protect them, even if everything else fell apart. What happened instead was something far darker than any of them could have predicted. When the Nazis began their systematic persecution and then extermination of European Jewry, Swiss banks did not protect these accounts. They did something far worse. They sat on them. Entire families were wiped out in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and the banks simply waited. When the war ended and the few surviving relatives came looking for their family's money, the banks demanded death certificates. Think about that for a moment. They demanded official documentation of death from families whose loved ones had been marched into gas chambers, whose bodies had been burned in industrial ovens, who had been thrown into mass graves across Eastern Europe. There were no death certificates. There were no graves. There was nothing but ash and memory. And the banks knew this. They knew exactly what had happened. And they used that bureaucratic impossibility as a wall to hide behind, while they quietly absorbed the unclaimed fortunes of murdered families into their own balance sheets. One story captures this cruelty perfectly. A woman named Greta Beer, who was 97 years old when the dormant accounts scandal finally broke in the 1990s, had spent decades searching for the money her father had deposited in Swiss banks. Her father had been a wealthy textile manufacturer in Germany before the war. After the war, Beer and her mother went to Switzerland repeatedly, visiting banks, providing whatever documentation they could, begging for information about their family's accounts. Every time they were turned away. The banks would not confirm whether the accounts existed, would not disclose any balance, would not acknowledge any relationship. Beer spent the better part of her adult life fighting this wall of bureaucratic silence. When her case finally became public in the 1990s, it helped trigger the congressional hearings that led to the entire scandal unraveling. She had spent 50 years waiting for a system designed to exhaust her into giving up. And she never gave up. The bank's attitude in the post-war decades was summed up by one historian who described it bluntly. The unspoken stance was that the unclaimed deposits were spoils of war, and now that the war was over, the banks got to keep them. Now, this was not some rogue operation by a handful of corrupt officials. This was systemic. In 1994, the executive director of the World Jewish Congress, a man named Elin Steinberg, charged that Swiss banks still held between 10 and 20,000 dormant accounts containing the assets of Jewish Holocaust victims. 20,000. And the banks had spent the previous 5 decades insisting that there were only a tiny handful of such accounts, that the matter had been settled long ago, that there was nothing more to discuss. They were lying. They had been lying for 50 years. And in 1949, Switzerland had done something particularly cynical. It signed a treaty with the newly communist government of Poland, agreeing to trade Swiss bank accounts held by Polish depositors, people from whom nothing had been heard since before the war, in exchange for compensation for Swiss-owned assets that Poland had nationalized. In other words, the Swiss government traded away the accounts of murdered Polish Jews to get compensation for its own financial losses in Eastern Europe. The dead were not just forgotten. Their remaining assets were bartered away like surplus inventory. But the dormant accounts were actually the smaller part of the scandal. The far bigger story, the one that truly implicates the Swiss financial system in the machinery of mass murder, involves gold, Nazi gold, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of it, flowing through the vaults of the Swiss National Bank while Europe burned. Here's how it worked. As the German army swept across Europe, the Nazis systematically looted the gold reserves of every country they conquered. They seized roughly $550 million worth of gold from occupied nations, including $223 million from Belgium and $193 million from the Netherlands. These are 1940s dollars, by the way. Adjusted for inflation, we are talking about billions. But it wasn't just sovereign gold. The Nazi regime had established a system of industrial-scale theft from individuals that operated with the precision of a corporate logistics operation. The SS stripped Jewish families of their jewelry, their watches, their wedding rings. They pulled gold fillings from the teeth of corpses in the death camps. And all of this was carefully cataloged and processed. The Reichsbank president, Walter Funk, had made a personal arrangement with SS leader Heinrich Himmler to deposit the loot from Holocaust victims under a fictitious name, Max Heiliger. This account became the repository for the personal wealth of millions of murdered people. Jewelry, gold coins, dental gold, eyeglass frames, wedding bands, all of it was processed through the Max Heiliger account. A special SS officer named Bruno Melmer was responsible for transporting the valuables from the death camps to the Reichsbank in Berlin, making at least 76 separate shipments. The items arriving at the Reichsbank sometimes still bore the stamps of the camps they came from. There were packages stamped Auschwitz. There were others marked with the names of other killing centers. The Reichsbank employees who processed these shipments knew exactly what they were handling. They sorted it, cataloged it, and sent the gold to the Prussian mint to be melted down and recast into standard bars. All of this gold was sent to the Reichsbank in Berlin, where it was melted down and recast into bars. Some of the shipments arriving at the Reichsbank literally bore the stamp Auschwitz. The Germans then took this remelted gold, this gold that was, in some cases, literally extracted from the mouths of murdered men, women, and children, and they shipped it to Switzerland. The Swiss National Bank accepted it. They accepted hundreds of millions of dollars worth of it. A commission led by Swiss historian Jean-François Bergier later estimated that the Swiss National Bank received approximately $440 million in gold from Nazi sources during the war. That is roughly $8.5 billion in today's money. And the Bergier Commission found something even more damning. They found that the governing board of the Swiss National Bank knew at an early point that the gold they were handling was looted. They knew where it was coming from. They chose not to ask questions. In fact, as the Bergier Commission noted, attentive citizens could read in the Swiss press exactly where the gold the Reichsbank was circulating came from. If ordinary newspaper readers in Zurich and Bern could figure it out, the bankers at the Swiss National Bank certainly could. The system worked through a mechanism that was as elegant as it was amoral. The Reichsbank would melt down the looted gold in the Prussian mint, recasting it into standard bars to conceal its origins. These bars were then shipped to Switzerland, where the Swiss National Bank credited the Reichsbank's account with the equivalent value in Swiss francs. No certificates of origin were ever requested. No questions were asked about the sudden explosion in German gold reserves, despite the fact that it was public knowledge that the Reichsbank's own reserves had been heavily depleted by pre-war rearmament spending. The gold was arriving from somewhere, and everyone involved knew where that somewhere was. They just preferred not to say it out loud. It was not only the Swiss National Bank that handled this gold. Swiss commercial banks also received it, and the system extended far beyond simple deposits. Switzerland functioned as a clearinghouse, moving looted gold onward to other neutral countries. The Banco de Portugal, for instance, maintained 3 parallel accounts with the Swiss National Bank, through which it purchased gold with Swiss francs that it had obtained by selling escudos to the Reichsbank through Swiss intermediaries. The entire system was an elaborate chain of transactions designed to obscure the origin of the gold and convert it into usable currency for the German war effort. Why did they do this? Because the arrangement was unbelievably profitable. The Nazis needed Swiss francs. Swiss francs were the key currency that allowed Germany to buy the raw materials it needed to keep fighting, things like tungsten from Portugal, iron ore from Sweden, chromium from Turkey. Without Swiss francs, those purchases were impossible, so the Germans brought their looted gold to Switzerland and traded it for hard currency. The Swiss National Bank functioned as the essential middleman, the laundromat that turned blood-stained gold into clean, spendable cash. And Switzerland was not just a passive intermediary. Other neutral countries like Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and Turkey also received looted Nazi gold, and roughly 3/4 of it was transferred through the Swiss National Bank. Switzerland was not just in the middle of this system. Switzerland was the system. Now, if the Swiss National Bank was the main artery, there was another institution that served as something like the hidden heart of this entire financial network. And most people have never even heard of it. It is called the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, and it is still around today, headquartered in a nondescript building in Basel, Switzerland. There is no flashy sign on the front, no logo visible from the street. It is the most secretive and powerful supranational financial institution in the world, and during the Second World War, it functioned as something that defies belief. The BIS had been created in 1930 to manage the reparation payments that Germany owed after the First World War. It was established with the backing of major central banks, including the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Wall Street financiers, particularly from J.P. Morgan, played a key role in its formation. From the very beginning, it was designed to exist above the laws of any single nation. Its charter granted it immunity from expropriation, taxation, and even banking supervision in Switzerland. Its senior officials enjoyed diplomatic status. It was, in effect, a sovereign entity floating above the world's financial system, answerable to no one. And when the Second World War broke out, this unique status made the BIS incredibly useful to the Nazis. One of its earliest and most scandalous wartime acts came in March 1939, when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia. The Czech National Bank had been prudent enough to transfer millions in gold reserves to a BIS account at the Bank of England for safekeeping. But when the Nazis occupied Prague and held the directors of the Czech National Bank at gunpoint, demanding they order the transfer of their gold, the BIS complied with the order. It transferred Czechoslovak gold from the Bank of England to the Reichsbank. Britain was not yet at war with Germany, but the transfer was nonetheless a flagrant facilitation of armed robbery on a national scale. The Czech gold was gone, and the BIS had helped make it disappear. During the war, the BIS was something extraordinary. It was a bank whose board of directors included representatives from countries that were actively at war with each other. British central bankers sat at the same table as Nazi financial officials, and the man running it all was an American. His name was Thomas McKittrick, and his story is one of the most bizarre and disturbing of the entire war. McKittrick was a Harvard-educated Wall Street banker who became president of the BIS in 1940, right as the war was intensifying. Under his leadership, the BIS willingly accepted looted Nazi gold. It carried out foreign exchange deals for the Reichsbank. It recognized the legitimacy of Nazi puppet regimes in occupied countries, which allowed the Axis powers to control the majority of voting shares at the bank. The vice president of the Reichsbank, a man named Emil Pohl, who would later be tried for war crimes, once referred to the BIS as the Reichsbank's only foreign branch. Let that sink in. The Reichsbank's own foreign branch, according to one of the men who ran it. McKittrick socialized with senior Nazi officials throughout the war. Hermann Schmitz, the chief executive of IG Farben, the industrial conglomerate that manufactured Zyklon B, the gas used to murder millions in the death camps, was a BIS board member. Schmitz sent McKittrick warm New Year's greetings in 1941, wishing him a prosperous year. It would certainly be another prosperous year for IG Farben. Their subsidiary was producing the chemicals that made industrialized genocide possible. Now, McKittrick's story gets even stranger, because he was simultaneously passing information about his Nazi colleagues to contacts in Washington. He had connections to the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA. He served as a conduit between the Allies and certain factions within the Nazi regime. Some historians have argued that this makes his position more complicated, that he was playing a dangerous double game. But the practical effect of his actions at the BIS was clear. Under his watch, looted gold flowed through the bank. The Nazi war machine was financially sustained, and when the war ended, McKittrick was not put on trial. He was not investigated. He was not sanctioned in any meaningful way. Instead, he was appointed vice president of Chase National Bank in New York, the very bank controlled by the Rockefeller family. He was even awarded the Royal Order of the Crown of Belgium, supposedly in recognition of his services during the war. The man who ran the Reichsbank's foreign branch was given medals and a promotion. When McKittrick died in a New Jersey nursing home in 1970 at the age of 81, the New York Times eulogized him simply as a world financier. His obituary described him as a man sufficiently daring to attend a bank meeting in Switzerland within earshot of a French-German artillery duel. That was the story. The rest, the looted gold, the Nazi board members, the foreign exchange deals for the Reichsbank, all of that was omitted. It was as if it had never happened. And McKittrick was not the only one. In 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, where the Allies gathered to design the post-war financial system, delegates from multiple countries called for the abolition of the BIS. They wanted it shut down. The resolution passed. The BIS was to be liquidated at the earliest possible moment, but it never happened. European central bankers lobbied behind the scenes, and by 1948, the resolution was quietly shelved. The BIS survived. It exists to this day, one of the most powerful and secretive financial institutions on earth. Now let's cross the Atlantic and look at what American banks were doing during all of this, because the complicity was not limited to Europe. Major American financial institutions were deeply entangled with the Nazi regime, and some of them continued doing business with Germany even after the United States entered the war. Chase National Bank, which was controlled by the Rockefeller interests and would later become J.P. Morgan Chase, kept its branch in Nazi-occupied Paris open throughout the entire war. While most American businesses fled France after the German invasion in 1940, Chase stayed. And it did not just stay passively. Declassified reports from the United States Treasury Department found that the Paris branch worked in close collaboration with the German authorities in freezing Jewish assets. The branch seized bank accounts and safe deposit boxes belonging to Jewish customers and did not properly return or account for them after the war. And the relationship was not reluctant or coerced. The head of the Chase Paris branch, a man named Carlos Niederman, wrote to his supervisors in Manhattan in May 1942, 5 months after Pearl Harbor, 5 months after the United States had officially gone to war with Germany, boasting that the bank enjoyed very special esteem with top German officials and was experiencing a rapid expansion of deposits. The bank was not just cooperating with the Nazi occupation, it was thriving under it, it was profiting from it, and the people running it in New York knew. J.P. Morgan had a similar story. Its Paris office maintained close working relationships with the Vichy French government throughout the occupation. A 1945 Treasury Department report found that the manager of Morgan's Paris office worked closely with the collaborationist regime. The report noted that the manager openly discussed what was described as the anti-Jewish record and policies of J.P. Morgan. A French government commission later identified 5 American banks that had seized Jewish accounts during the war: Chase Manhattan, J.P. Morgan, Guarantee Trust, Bank of the City of New York, and American Express. These were not obscure institutions. These were pillars of the American financial establishment. But perhaps even more troubling than the Paris operations was what Chase was doing on American soil before the United States entered the war. Between 1936 and 1941, Chase helped the German government build dollar reserves in the United States through a scheme involving special German marks known as Ruckwanderer marks. These were sold to Americans of German descent to encourage them to return to Germany. Chase and other banks helped facilitate this scheme, earning over $1.2 million in commissions. Over $500,000 went to Chase alone, and here is the particularly ugly part. The German government financed these commissions through the sale of discounted blocked marks that came primarily from Jews who had fled Germany. Jewish families escaping persecution had their assets seized and converted into these blocked marks, which were then sold at a discount, with American banks collecting fees on the transactions. Chase was most eager to expand this business after the November 1938 pogrom known as Kristallnacht, when Jewish emigration from Germany was at its most desperate. The bank was literally profiting from the flight of terrified Jewish families. The FBI began investigating the scheme in October 1940, using confidential sources within Chase National Bank itself, but by then the operation had been running for over 4 years. Declassified FBI records, released decades later under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998, provided a far more detailed picture than had ever been available before, tracing the money trail through banks and intermediaries and revealing just how calculated and profitable the arrangement had been. Now, let's go back to Europe and look at the German banks themselves, because their role was perhaps the most direct and the most damning of all. Deutsche Bank, Germany's largest financial institution, was deeply involved in the entire process of Aryanization. This was the systematic expropriation of Jewish-owned businesses and property, a process that began with the removal of Jews from corporate management positions and escalated into outright confiscation and theft. Deutsche Bank did not merely facilitate these transactions, it actively profited from them. The bank helped arrange the forced sales of Jewish-owned enterprises, taking fees and commissions on each transaction. It absorbed Jewish-owned private banks. It managed the financial logistics of property seizures across Germany and every country the German army occupied, from Austria to Poland to Czechoslovakia. And the involvement went even deeper. Deutsche Bank's subsidiary in Katowice, Poland, made loans to IG Farben for the construction of its factory complex at Auschwitz. The bank helped finance the building of the most notorious death camp in history. The bank also held accounts for the Gestapo, accounts that did not have names attached to them, only reference numbers, and these accounts were used to manage the proceeds from auctions of Jewish property that the Gestapo had seized. The money stolen from Jews was being deposited in accounts at Deutsche Bank and used for whatever commercial purposes the bank saw fit until the SS withdrew it. Dresdner Bank was even worse in some ways. It had been founded by a Jewish banker named Eugen Gutmann, but after Hitler came to power in 1933, the bank was completely purged. All 600 Jewish employees, from board members to bank clerks, were fired. Their pensions were canceled and confiscated. Nazi brownshirts stormed the bank's headquarters and smashed the bronze bust of the founder to the ground. The bank was declared Judenrein, cleansed of Jews, and it became the preferred financial institution of Heinrich Himmler's SS. When the Nazis annexed Austria in 1938, Dresdner Bank seized the Vienna-based Landerbank through a forced transaction. In Prague, the largest depositors in the Dresdner Bank subsidiary were the Theresienstadt ghetto and the SS office that handled the confiscated assets of Czech Jews before their deportation. The bank was using the stolen wealth of Holocaust victims as operating capital and then transferring that money to pay for the deportation trains heading east to the death camps. Historian Peter Hayes put it in terms that are as clear as they are chilling. The banks were using the money stolen from Jews to pay for the machine that was killing the Jews. It was a closed circuit of robbery and murder, with banking institutions serving as the essential connective tissue. And the enterprise was enormously profitable. Hayes, who was given access to the archives of multiple German corporations, has noted that the Holocaust itself made a profit for those who administered it. In the Netherlands, the cost of deporting roughly 110,000 Dutch Jews, the vast majority of whom died, amounted to only about 2% of the total value of the assets confiscated from the Dutch Jewish community. The arithmetic is sickening, but it is important to understand. The machinery of genocide was not a drain on German resources, it was a revenue center. Auschwitz alone operated at roughly 100% profit margin, collecting approximately 60 million Reichsmarks in revenue from inmate labor, while spending about 30 million to operate. The banks were at the center of all of this. They held the accounts. They processed the transfers. They financed the construction. They managed the proceeds. And they were fully aware of what they were participating in. And what happened to these bankers after the war, that is the part of this story that should make your blood boil. Because for the most part, nothing happened. There were a few trials. The United States put the leaders of IG Farben on trial, 23 of them, for war crimes. Krup's leaders were put on trial. 2 of the leaders of Dresdner Bank were prosecuted. But the sentences were shockingly mild, and the corporate world drew its conclusions very quickly. If you admitted you knew anything, you were admitting guilt, and that would lead to punishment. So they closed ranks immediately. They constructed a narrative that they had been forced into cooperation, that they had no choice, that they were merely following orders or operating under duress. This became the standard defense for an entire generation of German business leaders. We had to do it, we had no choice, and besides, we are necessary for the reconstruction of West Germany in the face of the communist threat. So let us forget about this and move on. And the remarkable thing is that this defense worked. It worked because the geopolitical context had shifted underneath everyone's feet. The Western Allies suddenly needed a strong, rebuilt West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet communism. The Morgenthau Plan, which had called for the deindustrialization of Germany, the dismantling of its big banks, and the prosecution of financial collaborators, was quietly shelved. A detailed investigation into Deutsche Bank, conducted by the Office of Military Government for Germany, known as OMGUS, had produced a comprehensive and damning report. The Deutsche Bank team, which included Jewish German immigrants, American public finance experts, and historians, had been able to conduct their research relatively freely in the immediate aftermath of Germany's defeat. They proved that the leaders of the bank had the closest political connections to the centers of Nazi power. The report documented Deutsche Bank's role in Aryanization, in the financing of war industries, and in the handling of looted assets. But the OMGUS report faded into obscurity after the Truman administration replaced Roosevelt and Cold War priorities took over. The bankers who had financed Auschwitz were now considered essential to rebuilding the German economy, and so they were forgiven. Or, more accurately, they were simply not pursued. The companies believed their own alibis and clung to their stories well into the 1960s and 1970s, when cracks slowly began to appear. But the evidence of their complicity remained largely hidden, because all of these companies sat on their archives, revealing nothing voluntarily for decades. This pattern of institutional amnesia held for nearly 50 years. The banks sat on their archives. Dresdner Bank literally hid its wartime records in a bunker in Berlin and never even cataloged them. Deutsche Bank kept its files locked away. The Swiss banks maintained their wall of secrecy, and the surviving families of Holocaust victims, many of them scattered across the globe, impoverished and traumatized, had no means to challenge any of this. The immediate post-war years had offered a brief window of potential accountability, but it closed quickly. In 1946, the Allies reached the Washington Agreement with Switzerland, in which the Swiss agreed to pay 250 million Swiss francs, roughly equivalent to 60 tons of gold, as a final settlement of all claims related to the laundering of Nazi gold. The Swiss negotiator, Walter Stuckey, was shrewd enough to label the payment as Switzerland's voluntary contribution to the reconstruction of Europe, injecting the reparations with neutral undertones and maintaining the fiction of Swiss innocence. The Allies, eager to move on and focus on the emerging Soviet threat, accepted this framing. And for the next 5 decades, Switzerland pointed to the Washington Agreement whenever questions about its wartime conduct arose, insisting that all matters had been settled and the case was closed. Meanwhile, the Allied established Tripartite Gold Commission distributed roughly 377 tons of captured Nazi gold back to the central banks of the countries it had been stolen from. But not a single ounce went to individual Holocaust survivors or their families. Every gram was returned to governments. The families who had been robbed and murdered saw nothing. It was a restitution framework designed by nations for nations, and the human beings at the center of the catastrophe were simply left out of the equation. In this atmosphere of collective forgetting, the banks prospered. Swiss banking grew into one of the most profitable industries on earth, fueled in no small part by the secrecy laws that had made it such an effective laundromat for Nazi gold. Deutsche Bank grew to become the dominant financial institution of the new West Germany. Chase National Bank merged and expanded, eventually becoming J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States. The BIS quietly reinvented itself as a forum for central bank cooperation, its wartime past buried under decades of technocratic respectability. The bankers, who had facilitated the financial infrastructure of genocide, were not just unpunished. They were rewarded. Their institutions grew larger, wealthier, and more powerful than ever. Then, in January 1997, something happened that cracked the whole edifice wide open. A 28-year-old night watchman named Christoph Meili was doing his routine rounds at the Union Bank of Switzerland, the country's largest bank, when he walked into the shredding room and found something that stopped him cold. 2 enormous bins overflowing with books and documents. They were old, clearly decades old, with handwritten entries in fountain pen. There were ledger books, contracts, lists of mortgaged buildings in German cities from the 1930s and 1940s, the years of Nazi rule. There were records from the German Reichsbank listing stock accounts for companies deeply implicated in the Holocaust, including BASF and Degussa, a company whose subsidiary had produced the Zyklon B used in the gas chambers. There were real estate records for Berlin properties that had been seized from Jewish owners by the Nazis, placed into Swiss accounts, and then claimed as the property of UBS. The bank was destroying these documents, shredding them. And this was happening in the middle of the biggest investigation into Swiss wartime banking conduct in history, at a time when Swiss law explicitly prohibited the destruction of material that might shed light on the Holocaust period. Meili did something that most people in his position would not have done. He took some of the documents home. He called a local Jewish organization. Within days, the story was on the front pages of newspapers around the world. The Swiss tabloid Blick ran a headline that captured the public mood perfectly. It simply said, "Dear UBS, it stinks." The fallout was immediate and seismic. UBS admitted that it had made what it called a deplorable mistake. Meili was fired. He received death threats. The Zurich authorities opened a criminal investigation against him, not against the bank for destroying Holocaust-era documents, but against Meili for violating Swiss banking secrecy laws. He was forced to flee to the United States with his family, where he was granted political asylum through a special act of Congress sponsored by Senator D'Amato, becoming the first Swiss citizen ever to receive such protection. The criminal investigation against him was eventually dropped, but only after the damage to his life had been done. Meili's discovery did something that decades of quiet diplomacy had failed to do. It turned the Swiss banks into international pariahs by linking their morally dubious wartime conduct to what appeared to be an unapologetic attempt to cover it up in the present day. Stuart Eisenstadt, the American diplomat who led the Clinton administration's investigation into wartime assets, later wrote that the Meili affair did more than anything to catalyze the process of reparations. The timing was devastating for the banks. They were caught destroying evidence at the very moment the world was watching. The revelation catalyzed a political firestorm. In the United States, Senator Alphonse D'Amato of New York launched congressional hearings into dormant Swiss bank accounts. Edgar Bronfman, the president of the World Jewish Congress and heir to the Seagram's fortune, personally met with President Bill Clinton in the Oval Office and enlisted his support. State officials across America began threatening boycotts of Swiss banks. The comptroller of New York City withheld an operating license for the merger of Union Bank of Switzerland with Swiss Bank Corporation, a deal worth billions. California's state treasurer suspended all investments and deposits from state funds in the American subsidiaries of Credit Suisse, Swiss Bank Corporation, and Union Bank of Switzerland. The Swiss government was blindsided. They had believed that all of these issues had been settled after the war, that the 1946 Washington Agreement had put everything to rest. Swiss Interior Minister Ruth Dreyfus, who was herself Jewish, was tasked with informing her cabinet colleagues about the full extent of Switzerland's wartime conduct. Many of them were genuinely shocked. The Swiss political system, with its collective leadership of 7 federal councillors rather than a single president, was simply not equipped to handle a crisis of this magnitude. As one Swiss diplomat later put it, their system was not adequate to handle political crises. Meanwhile, the independent audit that had been launched in 1996 was grinding through the records. Former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker headed the committee, and the audit that bore his name cost 300 million Swiss francs, paid for entirely by the banks. The Volcker Commission's work was painstaking. Teams of auditors examined individual account records, cross-referencing names, dates, and transactions across decades of banking history. When the final report came in December 1999, it identified the book value of all dormant accounts possibly belonging to victims of Nazi persecution that were unclaimed closed by the Nazis or closed by unknown persons at 95 million Swiss francs. The banks had insisted for decades that the number was negligible. 95 million Swiss francs is not negligible. The Breguet Commission was established to investigate Switzerland's entire relationship with the Nazi regime, and what it found was devastating. The Commission confirmed that the Swiss National Bank had received roughly $440 million in Nazi gold, more than half of which was looted. They confirmed that the bank's governing board knew where the gold was coming from. They found that Switzerland had turned away more than 24,000 Jewish refugees at its borders, even knowing by the summer of 1942 that Jews were being systematically murdered. The Commission also revealed that it was Switzerland that had suggested to Germany in 1938 that Jewish passports be stamped with a red letter J, making it easier to identify and turn away Jewish refugees at the border. This small bureaucratic detail, a letter on a passport, had cost untold numbers of lives. People who might have escaped the gas chambers were turned back at the Swiss frontier and sent to their deaths, and the idea to mark them had come from the Swiss themselves. Under relentless pressure from American politicians, class action lawsuits, and the threat of state-level sanctions, UBS and Credit Suisse finally agreed in August 1998 to pay $1.25 billion to settle claims by Holocaust victims and their heirs. It was an unprecedented sum, but it came with a condition that reveals the true priorities of the banking establishment. In exchange for the money, the plaintiffs agreed to release and permanently discharge the Swiss banks, the Swiss government, and Swiss industry from any and all future claims relating to the Holocaust. It was, in essence, a purchase of immunity, a financial transaction that closed the books forever, and even that settlement came with painful limitations. The Claims Resolution Tribunal analyzed more than 100,000 claims related to Swiss bank accounts. Only 4,600 dormant accounts were matched to specific claimants. The tribunal paid out $726 million on account-related claims and distributed another $288 million to 199,000 people who had been pressed into forced labor by the Nazis. In total, 457,000 Holocaust survivors and heirs received some payment from the fund. The final distribution was not completed until 2013, 15 years after the agreement was signed, by which time many of the oldest and most vulnerable survivors had already died. Meanwhile, the German banks eventually had their own reckoning, though it too was driven more by business necessity than moral conviction. In the late 1990s, as German companies sought to expand into American markets through major acquisitions and mergers, they found that their wartime histories had become a legal and reputational liability. Deutsche Bank's planned purchase of American Bankers Trust for $17 billion was directly complicated by the World Jewish Congress, which demanded compensation for wartime profiteering as a precondition for the merger. In 1999, German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder and representatives of 12 major German corporations, including Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, Daimler Chrysler, Siemens, and Volkswagen, announced the creation of a foundation for the compensation of Nazi-era forced laborers. The fund totaled $5 billion. Schroeder was remarkably candid about the purpose. He said the companies expected legal security, that no German enterprise would have to fear any further collective action. The aim was to knock the bottom out of campaigns aimed against the reputation of German businesses. And the American banks? They settled too, eventually. Barclays paid $3.6 million. Chase faced class action suits, but reached agreements with relatively limited scope. No executives were ever criminally charged. No institutions were fundamentally restructured. The settlements were treated as business costs, line items on balance sheets, the price of making an inconvenient problem go away. The thing that should haunt us about all of this is not just the scale of the financial complicity, it is the pattern. It is the way these institutions behaved before, during, and after the worst crime in modern history. Before the war, they saw opportunity in the dispossession of Jewish families and eagerly inserted themselves into the process. During the war, they laundered stolen gold, financed concentration camps, froze the accounts of persecuted people, and expanded their business under Nazi occupation. After the war, they constructed elaborate defenses, hid their archives, demanded impossible documentation from survivors, and waited for the generation that remembered to die off. And when they were finally confronted, decades later, they negotiated settlements that were designed not to deliver justice, but to purchase finality. Not a single senior executive of any Swiss bank was ever criminally prosecuted for wartime conduct. Thomas McKittrick of the BIS went on to a comfortable career at Chase. Hermann Apps of Deutsche Bank, who sat on the advisory board of IG Farben and oversaw the bank's business in the region that included Auschwitz, became one of the most respected figures in post-war German finance. He served as an advisor to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and played a central role in West Germany's economic reconstruction. The head of Chase's Paris branch, who had boasted of the bank's special esteem with the Nazis, was never disciplined. The Swiss National Bank officials who accepted gold melted from the dental fillings of murdered Jews retired with full pensions and honors. And here is perhaps the most disturbing part. Many of the institutions involved are not relics of history. They are alive and thriving today. UBS is one of the largest banks in the world. Credit Suisse was acquired by UBS in 2023 for over $3 billion, and as recently as 2025, the United States Senate was still investigating roughly 890 alleged Nazi-linked accounts that Credit Suisse may have withheld from the original settlement process. Think about that. Nearly 80 years after the end of the Second World War, a major Swiss bank is still suspected of concealing accounts linked to Nazi clients. When UBS executive Robert Karofsky testified before the Senate, he claimed that the financial issues had already been settled in 1999. It was the same argument the Swiss had been making since 1946. The case is closed. The books are balanced. Move on. But the Senate investigation has not moved on. It is expected to release its final report, and the full truth about what Credit Suisse withheld may finally come to light. Deutsche Bank is Germany's largest financial institution and a major player in global finance. JP Morgan Chase, the direct descendant of the Chase National Bank that froze Jewish accounts in Paris and profited from the Ruckwanderer mark scheme, is the largest bank in America by assets. The Bank for International Settlements still operates from its headquarters in Basel, still largely immune from public scrutiny, still wielding enormous influence over the global monetary system. In 2022, the BIS suspended Russia's membership following the invasion of Ukraine, a reminder that the institution still exercises power over who participates in the global financial system. But its own wartime history remains a subject that the institution handles with extreme delicacy, acknowledging the facts in carefully worded statements on its website, while avoiding any language that might suggest institutional culpability. The uncomfortable truth is that the financial infrastructure of the Holocaust was not an aberration. It was an extension of normal banking practices, taken to their most extreme and horrifying conclusion. The same secrecy that attracted legitimate depositors also protected stolen assets. The same neutrality that enabled international commerce also enabled the laundering of blood gold. The same profit motive that drives all banking activity drove these institutions to collaborate with a regime that was systematically exterminating millions of people. And the same institutional power that allowed them to thrive during the war allowed them to avoid accountability after it. There is a question that historians and ethicists have debated for decades, and it is worth asking directly. Did these financial institutions prolong the war? The evidence suggests they did. The Eisenstadt report, commissioned by the Clinton administration, concluded explicitly that neutral countries, and Switzerland in particular, continued to profit from their trading links with Germany, and thus contributed to prolonging one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. Without Swiss francs, Germany could not have purchased the raw materials it needed to sustain its military operations. Without the BIS, the financial channels between the Axis powers and the neutral world would have been severely disrupted. Every month the war continued, more people died, in the camps, in the ghettos, on the battlefields, and every month the banks continued to process the transactions that kept the killing machine funded. The settlements of the late 1990s brought a measure of material compensation to some survivors and their families. But compensation is not justice. No one went to prison. No institution was fundamentally reformed. The systemic conditions that enabled this collaboration, banking secrecy, institutional impunity, the subordination of ethics to profit, remain largely intact. The descendants of murdered families received checks, while the descendants of the institutions that profited from their murder continue to dominate global finance. Christophe Meili, the night watchman who blew the whistle on UBS, ended up working as a bank guard in New York for minimum wage. He stood in a lobby for 7 hours and 20 minutes a day, saying hello and directing people to elevators. He became the first Swiss citizen to receive political asylum in the United States, and his courageous act paved the way for a $1.25 billion settlement. But the lawyer who represented the Holocaust victims in the case, a man named Ed Fagan, was later disbarred for stealing client money and escrow trust funds from Holocaust survivors. Even the process of restitution was corrupted. So what are we supposed to take from all of this? I think the lesson is uncomfortable but essential. Capital has no conscience. Financial institutions do not possess moral compasses. They respond to incentives. During the Second World War, the incentives pointed toward collaboration with evil. The bankers who profited from the Holocaust were not, for the most part, ideological Nazis. They were businessmen following the logic of their profession, maximizing returns, managing risk, maintaining client relationships. They just happened to be doing it in the context of the greatest crime in human history. And when the crime was over, they applied the same professional logic to covering their tracks. The world has changed in many ways since the 1940s, but the fundamental dynamics of global finance, the secrecy, the impunity, the prioritization of profit over principle, these have not changed nearly as much as we might like to believe. In 2023, the collapse and emergency acquisition of Credit Suisse revealed that even in the 21st century, one of the banks most deeply implicated in the Holocaust asset scandal was still plagued by governance failures, risk management disasters, and a culture of secrecy that prioritized institutional self-preservation over transparency. The same institutional DNA that led Credit Suisse to conceal dormant Holocaust accounts in the 1940s was, in a different form, behind its inability to manage risk responsibly 8 decades later. Culture has a way of enduring even when the specific circumstances change, and that is precisely why this story matters, not just as history, but as a warning. Because the institutions that made the Holocaust financially viable are still here. They have new names on some of their buildings, new logos on their websites, new slogans about corporate responsibility and environmental governance and diversity. But the structures of power that enabled them to profit from genocide and walk away unpunished remain fundamentally intact. Consider this. The $1.25 billion settlement that the Swiss banks paid in 1998 sounds like a significant sum. But UBS alone reported revenues of nearly $40 billion in 2022. The settlement, spread over decades of payments, represented a fraction of a single year's revenue for one of the two banks involved. For institutions of this size, the cost of accountability was barely a rounding error. The fine for participating in the financial infrastructure of the Holocaust was, in the end, a manageable business expense. The vaults have been cleaned out. The ledgers have been settled, but the question of accountability, real accountability, remains unanswered, and that should bother all of us. Because when bankers can profit from genocide and face no meaningful consequences, the message to every financial institution on earth is clear. There is no crime so great that it cannot be settled out of court. There is no atrocity so monstrous that it cannot be reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. And that is not just a lesson from history, it is a warning about the future. If you made it this far, I would love to see you leave the word accountability in the comments. It would mean a lot to see